My name is Arden Vera, and I will never forget the moment a room full of applause turned into the stage for my public humiliation. The ballroom glowed beneath golden chandeliers. Champagne glasses clinked, laughter floated across the polished floor, and a massive banner stretched across the far wall, celebrating innovation. My name had just been called. After 17 years of sacrifice, I was to be honored for leading the design of the company's largest global system, a network worth $1.9 billion in contracts. I stepped forward, my heartbeat racing in rhythm with the applause. It should have been the proudest moment of my career. But instead of congratulations, Graham Delacroix, the CEO, raised his glass and silenced the room with the weight of his voice. "Let tonight be a reminder," he declared, pausing theatrically as every head turned. "Innovation may come from many hands, but control belongs to one. Effective this evening, Arden's salary will be reduced by 70%. The words struck like a blade. Applause died mid-motion. Forks hovered above untouched plates. Champagne froze inches from parted lips. Even the quartet stumbled before recovering with shaky notes. In a single sentence, Graham had turned celebration into spectacle. I stood frozen, not from confusion, but from fury contained beneath stillness. On the surface, my face remained calm, unflinching under the glare of 200 eyes. Inside, humiliation seared like fire, colliding with disbelief. This was not a reprimand whispered behind closed doors. It was a public execution of dignity, carried out on the very night meant to honor my contribution. For 17 years, I had been the backbone of this company. I had built its systems, carried its failures on my shoulders, missed birthdays, and sat in hospital corridors paying bills for my mother while still logged into servers. I had given everything, not for applause, but for stability. And now the man who had inherited his crown without lifting a finger chose to strip me bare in front of the very people who had benefited most from my work. Graham thrived on fear. He mistook intimidation for strength, humiliation for leadership. He thought this display would cement his dominance. But as I kept my silence, I caught the flicker of something he did not see. Investors at the front table leaned toward each other, whispering, their faces tight with unease. He believed he had broken me. What he didn't realize was this: his arrogance had just cracked his own empire. The silence from the ballroom still clung to me like smoke long after the applause had died. As I stood there, forcing myself not to flinch, one thought pressed against my ribs. 17 years. 17 years reduced to one sentence. When I joined the company, I was a 26-year-old engineer with nothing but a restless mind and a determination to prove myself. I didn't arrive with connections, family money, or polished charm. I came with a notebook of ideas, a second-hand laptop, and a belief that if I worked hard enough, I could build something that lasted. And so I worked. Night after night. I stayed at the office long after the cleaning crews left. I missed birthdays and anniversaries, sent apologetic texts to friends I no longer had time to meet, and watched from afar as family milestones passed without me. The company became my home. Though it never gave me warmth, it gave me pressure, endless, relentless pressure. But under that pressure, I built. There was pride in what I created. I still remember the first time our global servers held steady during a surge of millions of users. The dashboards glowing green, while executives who barely knew how the systems worked clapped each other on the back. I remember the night I signed my first major contract clause, one that saved us from paying penalties that could have bankrupted a smaller firm. I was invisible in those moments, but I knew the truth. Without me, none of it stood. That pride was laced with bitterness now. Every sacrifice had felt justified then. The weekends I spent coding in a fluorescent-lit office instead of with friends. The late nights when I sat in hospital corridors, juggling bills for my mother's treatment while my laptop balanced on my knees. I told myself it was worth it. That stability for the company meant stability for me. And yet, in the span of a breath, Graham had dismissed it all with a glass raised high and a smirk on his face. He had no idea what it meant to give yourself completely. Graham had inherited his crown. His path was a straight line paved by his father's legacy. Mine was carved from exhaustion and persistence. Sharpened by every rejection, I turned into resilience. I was proud of that. Even in bitterness, there was quiet pride, because what I built was real, and it could not be undone by his arrogance. But humiliation has a way of dragging old memories to the surface, and one memory clawed at me harder than the rest. It was 3:00 a.m., 2 years ago, when an alert ripped through my phone. The entire network was seconds away from collapse, a cascading failure that would have erased contracts, corrupted data, and destroyed investor confidence overnight. I pulled myself out of bed, drove half asleep to the office, and sat alone in the dim glow of monitors as I wrote patch after patch, fighting against the clock. Sweat blurred my eyes. My hands shook from exhaustion, but I held it together. At 4:12 a.m., the system stabilized. Millions of dollars were saved, reputations preserved, disaster averted. The next morning, Graham strolled into the boardroom in his tailored suit, smooth and untouchable. He smiled as if nothing had happened, and then he cleared his throat and said, "Gentlemen, you can thank decisive leadership for last night's stability." He didn't even glance at me. The board applauded. My name was never spoken. That morning burned in me like acid, and standing in the ballroom now, the taste returned. To him, my labor had always been disposable, my victories his to claim, my sacrifices invisible. And yet, I couldn't help the flicker of quiet pride that survived beneath the bitterness. Because Graham could steal credit. He could slash my salary. He could try to humiliate me, but he could never build what I had built. And that, I realized, was his weakness. The bitter taste of that memory still lingered when my eyes shifted across the ballroom to Graham Delacroix. Watching him bask in the attention of his loyal circle, I finally saw him for what he truly was, and the clarity was nauseating. Graham was not a builder. He had never soldered a wire, debugged a line of code, or drafted a clause that could withstand an audit. He was a man born with everything: private schools, trust funds, country club connections. Leadership had not been earned through sweat or sacrifice. It had been handed to him like a family heirloom, polished and gleaming, requiring nothing of him except the vanity to wear it. Even as a young executive, Graham had carried himself with a kind of smug assurance that comes only from someone who has never truly been tested. He spoke in boardrooms as though risk was a game, throwing around numbers that represented people's livelihoods as if they were poker chips at his private table. The truth was, he could afford to gamble. Losing millions would not change the course of his life. He had cushions upon cushions, assets, family backing, a safety net woven generations thick. I, on the other hand, had known what it was to scrape. I had known the weight of medical bills, the sting of being overlooked, the exhaustion of dragging myself home at 2:00 a.m., only to return at 7:00 a.m. the same morning. My authority came not from fear, but from competence. The quiet confidence that if I was in the room, the system would hold. Graham never understood that. To him, control wasn't about stability, it was about spectacle. He ruled by intimidation. His favorite strategy was humiliation, wielding it like a weapon. He believed people were more loyal when they were afraid of being shamed. Meetings with him were less about decisions and more about displays of dominance. He would cut off junior managers mid-sentence, sneer at proposals, slam his hand on the table to punctuate his superiority. It worked for some. Many bowed their heads, too afraid to challenge him. But to me, every outburst was another reminder of his fragility. A man who truly holds power doesn't need to shout. The longer I watched him that night, the more the disgust settled deep. I had given 17 years to building something enduring, while he had given nothing but orders from behind polished doors. And yet, he was celebrated as the architect of success. The face investors trusted, the name plastered on every headline. It was grotesque theater, and I suddenly understood why it had always felt suffocating to stand beside him. Then came the moment that burned itself into me. As the crowd dispersed into smaller conversations, I stepped away from the spotlight, hovering near a marble column at the edge of the ballroom. Graham's laughter carried across the space, deep and careless. He leaned toward a fellow executive, a glass of whiskey balanced casually in his hand. His voice, lowered just enough to seem private, but loud enough to travel, cut through the hum. "I can humiliate him in front of every single one of them," he said, chuckling, "and he'll still crawl back to work on Monday morning." The words landed like sparks on dry kindling. It wasn't just arrogance, it was contempt, pure and unfiltered. To him, I wasn't a colleague or even a subordinate. I was an object, a tool, something to be displayed, degraded, and expected to obey regardless. The ease with which he dismissed me in that sentence revealed everything. He believed I was trapped, that my devotion to the system would keep me tethered no matter how cruelly he cut me down. But he was wrong. What Graham didn't see was the shift happening in me, quiet but irreversible. His words, meant to dismiss me as powerless, instead lit the fuse of my resolve. For the first time, I no longer felt bound to silence. My disgust had hardened into clarity. He had declared himself untouchable. But every empire has a fault line, and his was arrogance. The disgust I felt that night did not blind me. It sharpened me, for years. I had learned to survive not through outbursts or confrontation, but through foresight. In a company run by arrogance, silence was not weakness. It was a shield, and sometimes a weapon. 2 years earlier, during one of the most grueling stretches of my career, I had sat across from overseas partners in a sterile conference room in Tokyo. The air buzzed with tension. Millions of dollars rode on the terms of those agreements. Graham had been there for the photo opportunities and the dinners. But when it came to the fine print, he vanished. That responsibility fell to me, and I took it seriously, not only for the company's sake, but for my own. I knew then what many of my colleagues refused to admit. Loyalty was conditional. Executives could celebrate you one week and discard you the next. I had watched brilliant minds escorted out with cardboard boxes, their years of service reduced to a line in a quarterly report. I would not let that be my fate. So, as I drafted the security clauses for those high-value contracts, I built in a safeguard. Hidden among technical jargon and cross-references was a single condition: any unilateral change to the compensation of the chief architect, me, without my signed approval, would render the contracts void within 24 hours. It was a quiet line, one sentence among hundreds, but it was ironclad. I spent nights refining the language until it was airtight. If anyone challenged it, the logic held. If anyone ignored it, the risk became theirs. To most eyes, it looked like another technical stipulation tied to system oversight. To mine, it was survival. I remember the moment a junior lawyer furrowed his brow while scanning the draft. He tapped his pen against the paper and said, "This clause here, are we sure it's necessary? It seems unusually specific." Before I could respond, one of the senior executives waved a dismissive hand. "Arden's just being overly cautious. You know how he is. He's protective of his work. It's fine. Move on." The lawyer hesitated, then nodded. The page turned, the conversation shifted, and the safeguard remained buried. That moment of arrogance, the refusal to take a closer look, became the seed of everything that followed. Cold calculation guided me. I didn't smile when the contracts were signed. I didn't celebrate when the partners shook hands. I simply filed away the knowledge that, should the day ever come when I was treated as disposable, The empire they built on my work could collapse in less than a day. It wasn't revenge then. It wasn't even defiance. It was protection, pure and simple. A chess move played early, when no one else was paying attention. Every time I reread the clause, a sense of quiet steadiness filled me. They could underestimate me in meetings, overlook me in reports, erase my name in presentations, but they could not erase that line of text. Now, standing in the golden glow of the ballroom, humiliation still fresh on my skin, I felt that memory return like a steel blade sliding into my hand. Graham thought he had humiliated me beyond repair. What he didn't realize was that he had just fulfilled the very condition I had written years earlier. I looked at him from across the room, glass raised high, basking in his illusion of control. The investors' faces were already tight with unease. None of them knew the exact words buried in those contracts. But I did, and I knew that within 24 hours. The stage he had built for himself would collapse under his own arrogance. The irony was almost too sharp to bear. A single clause, one sentence dismissed as paranoia, had become the fulcrum on which everything rested. They had ignored it. He had triggered it. And soon, they would all discover just how costly that oversight would be. The clinking of glasses had barely settled when Graham turned toward me with a flourish. In his hand gleamed a sleek fountain pen, gold-tipped, the kind meant for show more than function. He extended it toward me with a smile that was all performance. "Come on, Arden," he said, his voice dripping with mock warmth. "Let's make this official. Sign here. Let the world see how proud you are to be part of our future." A stack of documents lay neatly on the podium. To the crowd, it looked ceremonial, a token gesture, a symbolic signature to cap off the evening. To me, it was something far more dangerous. I knew what was buried in those pages. I knew what my signature would mean. I met his eyes, the pen hovering inches from my hand. My chest tightened, but not from fear. This was the moment I had been preparing for without even realizing it. My silence was louder than any refusal could have been. I let my hand hover above the paper, then slowly drew it back. Murmurs rippled through the guests. Some assumed I was stunned, humiliated, too broken to comply. They thought my hesitation was weakness. Only I knew the truth. This was calculation. My stillness forced Graham to fill the silence. To reclaim the spotlight he feared losing. And, predictably, he did, with a smirk. Graham straightened his tie, took the pen back from my hand, and scrawled his name across the top page with a flourish meant for the cameras. Flashbulbs sparked. Applause stumbled back to life, and he raised his arms slightly as though he had just conquered another stage. I remained still, my expression unreadable, while a quiet satisfaction unfurled inside me. The arrogance that had always defined him had just written its most costly line. He believed he had humiliated me further by signing in my place, by reminding the audience who truly commanded the stage. What he didn't realize was that his ink had sealed not my fate, but his, because among those ceremonial acknowledgments lay the supplemental clause confirmation, the very tripwire I had buried years ago, the safeguard disguised as ordinary technical language, waiting for the moment it would be triggered. His signature was the final key. No one in that ballroom knew what had just happened. To them, it was theater, another display of dominance, another performance by a CEO who loved the spotlight. To me, it was vindication. A chess game that had begun 2 years earlier had just tilted in my favor, and all I had done was refuse a pen. The applause eventually faded, replaced by the hum of conversation as guests turned back to their champagne and whispered judgments. Some pitied me, others dismissed me, but none of them mattered. Only one truth mattered. Graham had just handed me the very proof I needed to turn his empire against him. I let my gaze drift across the room, my breathing steady, my pulse calm, For the first time that evening, I felt no humiliation, no anger clawing at my chest, only a cool, quiet satisfaction. I had not needed to argue, to raise my voice, or to protest. I had let arrogance do the work for me, as Graham basked in the glow of cameras, his hand still resting on the documents. I could almost see the invisible countdown begin. 24 hours. That was the time frame the clause allowed. Within that window, the contracts he had paraded as triumphs would unravel, each one nullified by his own stroke of ink. I stood a step behind him, watching the flashes illuminate his grin. No one noticed my stillness, my silence, or the faintest trace of a smile tugging at my lips, because I knew what he did not. The empire he thought he owned was already collapsing, and he had been the one to light the fuse. The morning after the party arrived with a strange stillness. I had expected to wake restless, replaying Graham's smirk or the sting of his words. But instead, I felt a peculiar calm. It was the quiet before a storm, the kind of silence that hums beneath your skin because you know something irreversible has already been set in motion. I dressed with precision, knotting my tie slowly, choosing the darker suit I often wore during long negotiations. The mirror offered a reflection I barely recognized, composed, steady, almost detached. Beneath the surface, anticipation coiled like a spring, but I forced it down. Patience was the sharpest weapon I had. By 8:30 a.m., I stepped into the glass-walled lobby of the company. The atmosphere had shifted overnight. The usual rhythm of morning greetings and elevator chatter was gone. People moved in hurried strides, voices lowered to whispers, glances darting nervously from phone screens to one another. I walked through it all without a word, my briefcase steady at my side. At my desk, the first call came. A manager from our Tokyo branch, his voice tight with panic, reported that a $620 million transfer had been frozen without warning. Our largest Asian partner had suspended payments, citing contractual irregularities. The line crackled with his fear, but I remained silent, murmuring only that I would look into it. Then came the second call, this time from Singapore. Another suspension. Then Hong Kong. One after another. The alerts cascaded in, like dominoes toppling across the globe. Contracts that had seemed immovable only days ago were unraveling in real time. The very clause Graham had triggered was doing its work. Around me, the office swelled with whispers. Employees clustered in small groups near the elevators, their voices urgent, their eyes wide. What's happening? Did you hear about Asia? 600 million, frozen. Screens glowed with headlines, emails piled up with red exclamation marks, and the hum of uncertainty grew louder by the hour. I sat perfectly still, hands folded on the desk, eyes fixed on the documents in front of me, though I wasn't reading a word. Inside, my pulse hammered, but I gave nothing away. Let them think I was stunned. Let them think I was paralyzed. Silence was cover. It was better than explanation. Every so often, an executive hurried past, tie askew, phone pressed to ear, muttering words like breach, compliance, emergency. The chaos was blooming, and I could feel the pressure building in the walls of the building, pressing against the glass as though the empire itself was struggling to hold its weight. By 9:40 a.m., the CFO's assistant stormed past my office, pale and tight-lipped. I heard fragments of conversation. Contracts invalidated. Insurance won't cover. Graham needs to address this now. I kept my eyes lowered, the mask of composure intact, though inside, satisfaction pulsed like a quiet drumbeat. Then my phone buzzed with a private message. I glanced at the screen. It was from an old investor, one who had always taken my calls even when the board brushed me aside. Just 4 words glowed on the screen. Your safeguard worked. Now wait. I exhaled slowly, slipping the phone back into my pocket. The confirmation wasn't necessary. I already knew the trap had been sprung, but seeing it in black and white steadied me. This wasn't rumor or speculation. It was fact. I leaned back in my chair, letting the noise of the office wash over me. Phones ringing, heels clicking, voices rising in confusion. I said nothing. I offered no comfort, no explanation. The longer I held my silence, the more Graham would scramble, and the more the truth would tighten around him like a noose. Waiting is not weakness. Waiting is control. And on that morning, while $620 million froze across the ocean and panic spread through every corridor, I understood the power of stillness. By the time the clock struck 10:15 a.m., the chaos had already outgrown whispers. What began with frozen funds in Asia now spread like wildfire across continents. My inbox filled with alerts, each one sharper than the last. The first subject line read, "Urgent. European partner suspends 400 million contract." The second, "Contract void. Immediate action required." One by one, the pillars that held Graham's empire began to buckle. Another $400 million vanished into suspension before lunch. A figure so large it made even the most seasoned executives pale. The markets responded in kind, punishing us without hesitation. Stock tickers turned red, numbers plunging in real time. What had taken years to build unraveled in hours. I walked the halls in silence, my expression carefully blank, though inside a current of satisfaction coursed through me. I didn't need to announce anything. The system I had designed was speaking for me, stripping away Graham's illusions with every headline and every frantic phone call. By 11 o'clock a.m., the executive conference room was overflowing. Assistants carried in armfuls of documents. IT managers set up emergency video feeds, and board members dialed in from across the globe. The air vibrated with panic. But beneath it all, I felt a calm that was almost foreign. I slid into a chair at the far end of the long mahogany table, unseen, unacknowledged, from my vantage point. I could watch the storm consume them without lifting a finger. Graham paced at the head of the table. His tie loosened, his hair damp with sweat despite the cool air. He barked orders into 2 phones at once, demanding explanations no one could give. "We can't afford another suspension," he shouted, slamming one phone onto the table. "Get legal on this now. Find a clause, a loophole, something." But there was nothing. The clauses had been written by me, and I knew their strength. They weren't cracks to be patched. They were trapdoors that had already opened beneath him. Around me, executives whispered frantically, their voices low but edged with despair. "The partners are panicking. Stock is down 14% already. We've never seen a hit like this in one morning." I kept my gaze lowered, letting the papers in front of me blur into meaninglessness. What mattered wasn't on those pages. It was in the faces around the table. I saw fear where arrogance once lived. I saw doubt beginning to bloom, directed not at me, but at Graham. The satisfaction was sharp, but I held it close, careful not to let it show. To reveal too much now would break the rhythm. Silence was still my strongest move. Then it happened. In the middle of a heated exchange with the CFO, Graham's composure cracked. The man who had built his identity on unshakable dominance lost control in front of everyone. His fist slammed down on the polished wood so hard that glasses rattled and one shattered against the floor. "Damn it!" he roared, his voice raw. "This company doesn't fall apart over paperwork." The room froze. No one spoke. No one moved. For the first time, they saw what I had always known. Beneath his cultivated authority was nothing but panic waiting to break through. His power had always been theater, and the performance was unraveling. I leaned back slightly, my face calm, my breathing steady. Inside, vindication burned hot and clean. This was the moment I had long imagined. The day Graham would reveal himself not as a leader, but as a man unprepared for real consequences. And he had delivered it himself, right on cue. By 12:30 p.m., the conference room had turned into a pressure chamber. The air was thick with the heat of too many bodies, the smell of sweat and paper, the static of overlapping voices. Executives barked at one another, phones rang and were slammed down, and every few minutes another report flashed on the screen, showing the company's market value bleeding away in red numbers. At the head of the table, the CFO shuffled through a stack of contracts, his face growing paler with each page. He had been in finance for decades, a man known for his calm, even in turbulence. But that day, he looked like a surgeon who had just opened a patient and found the wound was beyond repair. Finally, he pushed his chair back with a screech that silenced the room. His hands trembled as he adjusted his glasses. "These contracts," he said, his voice thin, "they're not suspended, they're void." The words hit harder than any alarm. "What do you mean, void?" Graham barked, his face flushed, sweat dripping down his temple. "I mean," the CFO said, barely able to meet his eyes, "our partners are within their rights. The agreements are written so clearly. There's no room for appeal. These deals don't exist anymore. They're gone." Murmurs broke into shouts. "That's impossible," someone yelled. "Call the insurers," another demanded. "There must be a fail-safe." The CFO shook his head slowly, each motion heavier than the last. "Insurance won't cover this. They only insure against unforeseen damages, not contractual nullifications. This isn't an accident, it's a clause. Whoever wrote this designed it to be ironclad." The room erupted. Voices collided into a storm of panic. Executives shouted into phones. Some cursed under their breath. Others simply stared into space as if the floor beneath them had given way. Years of expansion, billions in projected revenue, all disintegrating in real time. Through it all, I sat quietly, my hands folded on the polished table, my breathing measured. I watched as papers scattered, tempers flared, and reputations crumbled. The satisfaction that spread through me was sharp, but I kept it hidden beneath a mask of neutrality. Let them think I was stunned like the rest. Silence was still my most powerful disguise. Across the table, Graham's fury boiled over. He slammed his palm against the surface so hard the pens rattled. "Then fix it," he demanded. "You're the damn CFO. Find a way to reverse this." But even his roar couldn't conceal the tremor in his voice. For the first time, the man who ruled by fear looked afraid himself. Then it came, the spark that shifted everything. A junior lawyer, barely in his 30s, had been flipping through the contracts at lightning speed. His brow furrowed deeper with each line. Suddenly, he shot to his feet, his voice breaking above the chaos. "Who wrote this clause?" he shouted, waving a page in the air. "Who put this language in the contracts?" The noise died instantly. Shouts choked off, phones lowered, chairs creaked as heads turned. The room fell into a silence so sharp it rang in my ears. One by one, their eyes shifted, past the CFO, past the executives, past Graham himself. They turned toward the far end of the table, toward me. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply sat there, my face calm, my silence unbroken, even as the weight of 24 stares pinned me in place, inside. However, a restrained satisfaction pulsed steady and strong. The trap I had laid years ago was no longer invisible. It was visible to everyone now, undeniable, irreversible. And the irony was exquisite. Graham had demanded loyalty through humiliation, yet in his arrogance, he had just exposed the one person he could never break. By 2:00 p.m., the tension in the conference room had reached a fever pitch. Executives barked into phones, lawyers shuffled stacks of papers, and assistants rushed in and out with the urgency of paramedics in an emergency ward. The company felt like a patient on the table, hemorrhaging faster than anyone could stitch the wound. Then Graham raised his hand, demanding silence. His tie was askew, his face flushed, but his voice carried with the old force of command. "I've engaged the best," he declared, his chest puffed, his eyes blazing. "We've retained Caro and Hunt, the top legal firm in the country. If anyone can untangle this mess, it's them." For a moment, the room shifted, shoulders straightened, a few sighs of relief escaped. Caro and Hunt had a reputation for salvaging disasters, for finding loopholes where none existed. The board members exchanged glances, the panic in their faces softening. Graham seized on it instantly. "You see?" he said, pacing again with renewed vigor. "This is not the end. It's a stumble, nothing more. By tomorrow, we'll have clarity. Contracts will be restored. The market will rebound. All of this hysteria," he gestured sharply to the room, "will look like an overreaction." He even smiled, the same smug curve of lips that had cut me down the night before. Watching him, I felt the tension coil tighter in my chest. I knew better, but I said nothing. I let him savor the illusion, because illusions are most dangerous when they are closest to breaking. By 3 p.m., Caro and Hunt was fully engaged. Their senior partners dialed into video calls. Their associates dissected the contracts clause by clause. And their voices filled the room with the clipped confidence of professionals who had never lost a battle. "We'll find the thread," one of them said. "We always do." Graham straightened, his old swagger returning. He even turned toward me once, his eyes narrowing in triumph, as if to say, "See? Even your paranoia can't hold against real power." The board members, weary from hours of panic, leaned back in their chairs, some even allowing themselves weak smiles. The storm, they thought, had been weathered for a few hours. That illusion held. Phones quieted slightly. The volume in the room dipped. People spoke of contingencies, of damage control, of waiting for Caro and Hunt to deliver. Graham stood taller, barking fewer orders now, speaking instead of recovery and resilience. But illusions have a half-life, and theirs was short. At 6:40 p.m., the call came. The line was placed on speaker, the voice of Caro and Hunt's lead partner filling the room. His tone was calm, but edged with something dangerous. Finality. "We've completed our review," he said. "I'm afraid the contracts cannot be reinstated. The nullification clause is absolute. It's not a suspension. It's termination, irreversible." A collective intake of breath swept the room. "There must be something," Graham snapped, his voice cracking at the edges. "Some precedent, some challenge." The lawyer interrupted, his tone colder now. "Mr. Delacroix, the clause was activated by your own signature. It is airtight. Your mark is the legal trigger. This isn't a matter of appeal. It's over." The silence that followed was suffocating. The board members sat motionless, their eyes shifting from the speakerphone to Graham, and then to each other. Relief curdled into dread. The brief victory they had clung to dissolved into ash in an instant. Then came the shift. A director at the far end of the table leaned forward, his voice steady but lethal. "You signed it." Another followed. "You triggered it?" And then another. "You've cost us billions." The murmurs rose, sharper, angrier, turning into open blame. One by one, they spoke not of contracts, but of leadership, of Graham's failure, his arrogance, his recklessness. The tide had turned. The board that once applauded him now circled like wolves. And for the first time, Graham was the prey. I sat at the edge of the table, hands folded, face impassive, inside. The tension gave way to something steadier, colder. The empire was collapsing, and all I had to do was watch. By 7:30 p.m., the last remnants of Graham's bravado had begun to fray. The boardroom was no longer just a place of panic. It was a tribunal. Documents littered the table, contracts marked with red ink, emails projected on the screen. and every face around the mahogany surface pointed its frustration at one man. The CFO's voice carried the weight of a funeral announcement. Because the nullification clause was activated by your personal signature, Graham, liability does not fall solely on the corporation, it extends to you, individually. Graham blinked, uncomprehending at first. What do you mean, individually? The CFO pressed his lips into a thin line. I mean your personal assets are on the line. Houses, trusts, offshore accounts, everything. The contracts contain stipulations binding the signatory, not just the entity. The silence that followed was suffocating. Graham swayed slightly where he stood, as though the air itself had betrayed him. For years, he had moved through the world like a man untouchable, protected by layers of lawyers, accountants, and generational wealth. And now, in the span of a single evening, those layers had been stripped away. One of the directors leaned forward, his voice sharp as glass. You didn't just endanger the company, you've endangered yourself, and by extension, all of us. Another added, investors will not shoulder this loss alone. They'll come for blood. Yours. The words cut deeper than any accusation of incompetence. For the first time, Graham's face showed true fear. His jaw slackened. His hands trembled at his sides. He looked not like a titan of industry, but like a man suddenly aware of the guillotine's shadow above his neck. I watched him from the far end of the table, my expression composed, my silence intact. There was no need to speak. Every revelation, every exposure, was slicing into him far more effectively than any word from me could. The lawyers circled him like surgeons delivering terminal news. Your trust funds are not shielded. The clauses specify forfeiture of any assets tied to the signatory's personal estate. The board can, and will, pursue damages from you directly. Graham's mouth opened, but no sound came. He had built his life on the illusion of safety, the arrogance of thinking the consequences of his decisions would never reach his own doorstep. Now that doorstep was crowded with creditors, lawsuits, and ruin. And then came the final blow. One of the senior lawyers, a woman with eyes like flint, set her papers down and looked at him with brutal clarity. There is only one way out of this, she said. The only person who can reverse what has been triggered, the only one who can save you, is Arden. The room turned as one. I felt 24 pairs of eyes burn into me, waiting for a flicker of expression, a word, a hint of willingness. But I gave them nothing. My face remained calm, my gaze steady, my silence unbroken. Inside, though, satisfaction curled cold and sharp. The man who had humiliated me before a ballroom of hundreds now stood stripped, his empire crumbling, his wealth threatened, his pride gutted. And the irony was merciless. The only lifeline extended to him belonged to the very man he had tried to destroy. The tension in the room thickened as Graham's eyes finally met mine. His face was ashen, his lips quivered, his arrogance dissolved into desperation. For the first time, he looked not at me as an underling, but as something else entirely. His last hope. I held his gaze in silence, letting the truth hang heavy in the air. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and Graham knew it. 1 week later, the numbers told the story better than words ever could. The contracts worth $1.9 billion, every last one of them, had dissolved into nothing. What had once been a global empire of deals and promises was now a field of ashes. The markets responded without mercy. Shares that had once been Graham's badge of honor plummeted daily. The ticker a waterfall of red. What had been valued at billions was now a fraction of its former self. The company's name whispered on Wall Street, not with respect, but with ridicule. The empire he had flaunted so proudly was disintegrating before the world's eyes. Inside headquarters, the atmosphere was equally unrecognizable. Where once there had been forced cheer and staged confidence, there was now an oppressive gloom. Hallways echoed with urgent whispers, Desks sat abandoned as employees polished resumes, and the company cafeteria, once buzzing, resembled a morgue. And at the center of it all was Graham Delacroix, a man who only days earlier had strutted through these corridors like a monarch. Now he was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his movements jerky with exhaustion. Board members no longer deferred to him. They avoided him. Executives spoke his name only in whispers. His power had not just diminished, it had evaporated. By Monday morning, he was forced to stand before the board, his resignation letter in hand. The man who had once boomed commands across the table now struggled to get through 2 sentences without his voice cracking. "Effective immediately," he said. "I will be stepping down as Chief Executive Officer." There was no applause, no polite nods, no acknowledgement at all. The room was ice. He had gone from tyrant to ghost in less than a week. And the blows didn't stop there. Lawsuits arrived in waves, shareholders seeking damages, partners demanding restitution, regulators demanding answers. His wealth, once untouchable, was now in jeopardy. His mansions, his trust funds, his carefully curated fortune, all were under siege. What had been private humiliation soon became public spectacle. Headlines blared, "CEO topples after $1.9 billion collapse." News anchors dissected his downfall with glee, replaying the moment he slammed his fist in anger, speculating on how a single clause had brought him down. Late-night hosts turned him into a punchline, their audiences roaring with laughter at his expense. And through it all, I remained silent. I walked the halls of the company as though nothing had changed, offering no commentary, no outward satisfaction. But inside, relief and satisfaction coursed through me. 17 years of sacrifice had been mocked, my dignity publicly shredded. But now the balance had been restored. The man who tried to reduce me to nothing had been reduced himself. The final twist arrived not from me, but from those who had once cheered Graham. At a board meeting crowded with desperate faces and weary investors, one voice broke through the noise. "We will only renegotiate," said a lead investor, his tone measured but sharp, "if Arden is at the table." The words dropped like a hammer. The room stilled, heads turning toward me with an intensity I had come to know well, unlike before. There was no contempt in their eyes, only recognition. They understood what Graham never had. I was the foundation, without me. The company had no future. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a breath that felt free, unburdened. It wasn't victory born of shouting, or revenge carved from cruelty. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth had surfaced at last. The empire hadn't collapsed because of me. It had collapsed because of him, and because he underestimated the man he thought he could humiliate. And now, with Graham gone and the future uncertain, the room finally saw me not as a shadow, but as the one who remained. The boardroom was quieter now, the frenzy of lawsuits, the frantic calls with international partners, the endless attempts to salvage a sinking empire, all of it had slowed to a weary crawl. The dust of Graham's collapse had settled, leaving behind a company stripped bare, but still breathing, and in that silence, the board turned to me. Their request was unanimous, spoken with both urgency and desperation. "We need you as our next CEO." The words hung in the air, heavy with expectation. For years, that title had been dangled like an unreachable prize. It represented power, recognition, and the authority Graham had always denied me. Now it was mine for the taking, served on a silver platter. But I shook my head. "No," I said simply, my voice steady. "I didn't endure all of this just to become the very thing I despised." The room blinked in disbelief. Some argued, others pleaded. But I did not waver. My path was not to replace Graham, to sit in his chair and inherit his throne of arrogance. My path was different. "I'll remain," I continued, "but as a senior advisor, I'll guide the systems I helped build. I'll protect the foundation, but I will not wear the crown. The board, after a long pause, accepted my decision, perhaps reluctantly, but they saw the truth in my words. Leadership isn't about titles, it's about responsibility. And responsibility, I had learned, could be wielded without the trappings of power. In my new office, stripped of pomp and vanity, I hung only one decoration, a framed copy of the document Graham had signed that night at the gala. His bold signature, once a symbol of dominance, was now a monument to downfall. I placed it on the wall not as a trophy, but as a reminder that arrogance carries within it the seed of its own destruction. Each day, as I worked quietly with teams who once overlooked me, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The humiliation of the gala, the years of sacrifices erased in a single sentence, the sting of public shame, all of it dissolved as I reclaimed what Graham had tried to steal, my dignity. Colleagues began to approach me differently, not with fear, as they had with him, but with respect born from trust. They knew I wouldn't raise my voice to command silence. They knew I wouldn't crush them with humiliation. They knew I had endured, and in enduring, I had proven something Graham never could. Freedom isn't the absence of struggle. It is the ability to walk through fire and emerge carrying only what matters: honor, clarity, and resolve. And so I lived not as a conqueror, but as a survivor, not as a CEO, but as a man who had once been humiliated in front of a glittering ballroom and chose not vengeance, but vindication. The twist of irony was never lost on me. Graham had tried to immortalize himself in dominance, and yet the only legacy he left behind was a framed signature, a reminder of how power can crumble in a single arrogant stroke. I would sometimes stand before that frame and reflect, not with bitterness, not even with triumph, but with a philosophy that had crystallized in me through the ordeal. Power doesn't vanish in a single explosion, I would say to myself. It erodes in silence, chipped away by arrogance, until one careless decision brings the entire edifice crashing down. That was the truth Graham never learned, and the truth I carried forward, not as a weapon, but as wisdom. And now, to you, those who have walked with me through this story, I'll leave you with this. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the sharpest blade, the clearest voice, and the strongest shield. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever known the sting of injustice, or the quiet fire of dignity reclaimed, I invite you to share your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Let me know your own experiences. If you found meaning here, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe so we can continue exploring stories of resilience, justice, and truth together, because every voice matters. And sometimes, the loudest victories are the ones earned in silence.